Hey guys, Justin Kemple here, and this is Manuscript History. Today, we talk about the medieval formation of the English language. So, anyone watching this video obviously speaks English. Well, maybe an American version of it, but you probably understand what I'm saying. Well, how far back in time could you go and still understand somebody supposedly speaking English? How did the modern English language come to be? Well, I believe that most of it has its roots in the medieval history of England, and I hope today I can shed some light on the subject. Now then, I would like to start with the language of Beowulf Old English. So what is Old English? Well, you could say it's the language of the Germanic settlers in the British Isles, and is mainly spoken from the Germanic settlement of England in the 5th century to that of the Norman conquest in 1066. While there are other people more indigenous to the British Isles that have spoken a number of different languages that we can retrace, those tended to take a different route and were not based on the Proto-German like the English language is. The language of example, the Celts, which predates Old English by quite a bit, is now what makes up the basis of Irish, Welsh, Cornish, Manx, and Erse, or Scottish. Those people migrated to England around 1000 BC. The Celtic language was the main language of England until the Romans arrived. Now then, Julius Caesar set up the first colony in Rome, or of Rome, in what is now what they call Britannia at the time, around 55 BC. And that colony lasted until about the middle of the 5th century. And of course, the language of the Romans was Latin. During that time, this would have been the primary and the most prestige language of the people living in Britannia. It was the language of administration, the language of learning, and that of belief. And Latin and Celtic didn't really mix up too much unless it was something like, really only to describe places or some people, and sometimes things like the word river, for example, or in Celtic, Avum. And this kind of explains why there is a number of different rivers in England named Avum. Latin lasts as the primary language of England until around the middle of the 5th century, like I mentioned earlier, and the decline of Rome. Up until that point, there had been a number of Germanic groups that had actually been settling and invading the British Isles for probably about a century or so. And those efforts really ramped up in the 5th century when the Romans finally decided to leave. Now, these groups included the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and many others. They moved farther and farther west as time went on, and they set up colonies such as East Anglia and Wessex, and the Kingdom of the Anglians, in the north, for example. And this is what leads to the name Angleland. Over many centuries, this is shortened to England. Then, 1066 happens. A great day in history for a lot of historians and some people, the Norman conquest, and that of William the Conqueror, that conquered England. But it can also be said that William the Conqueror and the Norman Conquest took over the English language as well. This isn't exactly true for most people of the time. While French-speaking Normans may have generally changed the language of the aristocracy of English to French, this really wasn't the case for more of the common people of the land. This does change over time, though. Now then, from the 11th century in 1066 up to probably the 14th century, Old English gradually borrows more and more words from Norman French. Well, why is this? Well, typically when two languages meet, the language that has more prestige tends to be used more and more. And this is definitely the case with French. Think for a moment about words that describe, fancy things: chandelier, restaurant, cafe, culture, entrepreneur, for example, and so on. These are all French words originally, and you regularly use French words and versions of those words to describe higher quality items, such as something like a boutique shop, for example. Since the noble elite of England were all French, the fancy things and ideas of the nobles tended to be French in vocabulary. French also brings words in where there were no words for something before. Unlike German, that tends to use words that already exist to describe new things, the French tend to make completely new words. This mixes with anglo-saxon of the area and begins to change both of the languages. Now, by the time we reach the mid-14th century, England is really a land of 3 different languages: a variation of Old English and German, Latin, and Norman French. All of these are being mixed together and spoken in very many different variations and accents. Latin was the language of religion and science, French was the language of the court and government along with high society, and English was the language of the street or the farm, people, and of general communication in the area. The mixing of these three languages comes to a head with the poet Chaucer, or at least he's the most famous example. He's a trilingual writer, but he really only writes poems in English. It's just that his version of English is what forms the basis of what we now know as Middle English. His version of the language is a form of the London Standard and happened before the Great Vowel Shift. In Chaucer's version of English, we see a number of Old English words changing as well. For example, what becomes what, ring becomes ring, and flute becomes loud. There are no silent letters in his version of English. Night, for example, would be pronounced knickte. This is actually what the inspiration for the joke in Monty Python and the Holy Grail comes from. This is also the first time in poetry that we know of that someone uses both Latin and French in English poems as well. This is why he is really such an important moment in the formation of Middle English. Finally, during the late 14th and early 15th century, English really begins to return as a prestige language in England instead of French. So how does this happen exactly? How does English become the official language of the land? Well, after the Norman conquest of 1066, there isn't really a single official use of English for almost 2 centuries, and that is in 1258, when instead of just using French, Henry III decides to release a document in all 3 languages, French, Latin, and English. However, even this document was really only written in French originally, and then is later translated to do business with some other entities. It's not until a full century after that even that Parliament, for the first time ever, is opened with a speech in English instead of French. But even then, the records of that speech are still only in French. French here is still really the language of written law and record and all transaction. Now then, the next major step is where King Henry V and his reign begins, and he finally marks English as an official language of the land alongside French in 1413. We also know that the first noble we know of that speaks English due to his will being in English is the Earl of Kent, and that is in 1397. Even until the year 1485, official records are still only produced in French though. After 1489 though, all documents and statutes are solely in English. There is essentially a century of transition from French to English. So now, we come to the Great Vowel Shift. This happens around the middle of the 15th century and lasts until the end of the 16th century. From the time of Chaucer to the time of Shakespeare, there is a profound difference in the way that we pronounce all English words. The way we pronounce the vowels A, E, I, O, U in stressed positions of word dramatically changes. Before this time, words are still pronounced very differently. Instead of meat, for example, we say mate. Instead of name, we say nama. Instead of house, we say hus. This is the biggest change that separates Chaucer's Middle English from what we know as Modern English. Now then, I could probably talk about Shakespeare and Modern English for a while, but that's most likely a topic for another video as there's really a lot to cover. And I think there's a bigger influence on Modern English anyways, and that is the King James Bible published in 1611. The history of Modern English, I think, really begins with this version of the translation of older English Bibles. So why is that? Why is the King James Bible such an important point to Modern English? Well, in addition to adding new vocabulary and grammar, it also perhaps is one of the first and most printed books of all time. Some say there may now have been 1 billion copies of it sold at this point. It spread the English language all across the world. In its translation, it attempts to use some modern words of French and Latin, and it mixes it with the modern English of the time, Middle English, and Old English in an attempt to sound older, but in doing so creates a new way of speaking that we still use today. Alright guys, I think I could probably go on forever on this topic as I've taken 30 hours of lectures on it, but this video would be really, really long at that point, and I just wanted to hope maybe it got some information out to you guys that you can see the modern progression of Old German to Old English to Norman French to Latin and all these different things that mix up to make what we know as the modern English language today. Alright guys, if you enjoyed the video, Once again, please hit the like button and the subscribe button if you can, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.